bubble.
King James. Thank you. King James became the 6th King of Scotland at the age of 13 months after his father, King Henry, was murdered. Once James's mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, was remarried and was imprisoned due to an uprising against the new couple and was forced to give the throne to her son. After this, she fled to England seeking help from her cousin, Queen Elizabeth. But Elizabeth, seeing Mary as a threat, had her confined in various castles and houses throughout England. When he was a child, James was raised by several different families due to the fact that he was separated from his mother, and he was tutored by George Buchanan, who always told James about his mother's wickedness. But despite this, James was given a very thorough education. In 1587, Mary was condemned to death on the charge of supporting a Catholic plot to overthrow Queen Elizabeth, and with no protest from her son, she was beheaded. In 1589, James married Anne of Denmark, and shortly after she gave birth to their first son, Prince Henry. King James first became interested in witch hunting during a visit to Denmark, and after his return to Scotland, he attended the North Berwick witch trials. In 1597, he wrote the Daemonology, which opposed witchcraft and provided background for material for Shakespeare's Macbeth. But King James' reign was not without its troubles. The Gunpowder Plot. On the night of November 4th, 1605, a man named Guy Fawkes was discovered in the cellars of Parliament buildings, guarding a pile of wood and 36 barrels of gunpowder, enough to blow the buildings to rubble, and more than enough to kill the king. Fawkes and the other conspirators were tortured on the rack until their confession, which was followed by their execution. The death of King James. At the age of 50, King James suffered from arthritis, gout, and kidney stones, the loss of most of his teeth, and heavy alcoholism. In 1625, he suffered a stroke, and on March 27th, he died from an attack of dysentery. James was King of England for 22 years, and his reign in Scotland lasted for 35 years, ruling a total of 57 years, longer than any of his predecessors.
And now we're going to talk about witchcraft. Perfect. Now, when we're talking about witches, we're not just talking about Macbeth, but we're also talking about way before, such as the Old Testament, which viewed witches as an abomination. In fact, Exodus 22:18 said, "Thou shalt not suffer to let a witch live," which basically meant if you found a witch, you could burn her. It's fine. Also, the New Testament didn't take too kindly to witches either, and viewed it as an abomination. But instead of calling it witchcraft, they called it sorcery, keeping an open mind. Now, when we're talking about Macbeth's witches, the Weird Sisters, weird doesn't actually mean strange. It means fate. So they'd be called the Fate Sisters, which is kind of appropriate considering they tell everyone their fate. Now, these witches are left ambiguous in appearance and the way they talk, separating themselves from the human world and the world of the supernatural, as said earlier. Now, these witches are also left ambiguous as an allusion to how ambiguous their fortune-telling can be.
All right now, so for the real Macbeth. He was born in the year 1005, which was the same year that his grandfather, Malcolm II, became king. Macbeth was sent to a monastery at the age of 7 for his education. After Malcolm II's death, which, by the way, was from natural causes, Macbeth's uncle Duncan succeeded to the throne. Duncan ruled for a tenuous 6 years, but as a frail man, he was defeated on the battlefield by Macbeth on August 14, 1040. Macbeth ruled Scotland from the year 1040 until his death in the year 1057. Macbeth was defeated by Duncan's son, Malcolm, who later went on to become the king. Important differences. There are several important things that are different about the real Macbeth and the one in the play. First was that the real Macbeth had an actual claim to the throne through his mother's side of the family. Malcolm II was Macbeth's mother's father. Second, Macbeth was not a terrible ruler. That was Duncan. Scotland was so prosperous during Macbeth's reign that he was able to go on a pilgrimage to Rome. Third, Banquo probably wasn't a real person. He's mentioned in Holinshed's Chronicles as Macbeth's accomplice in the murder of Duncan, and he's portrayed as a genteel nobleman in Macbeth the play. but neither accounts for the fact that we don't know if he was real or not.
Now for themes.
So when the play begins, Macbeth seems to be a pretty normal dude. As the play progresses, though, and events go from bad to worse, he begins to change into a very different person. We encounter the theme of fate early in the first act, when we first meet the witches, and they tell Macbeth their prophecy about his becoming king.
He then tries to take fate into his own hands with the help of his wife and kills the king.
Bad day to be named Duncan. When Macbeth had become king without killing Duncan, was his fate already sealed in that way? Or was he meant to kill Duncan?
Who knows? He felt enormous guilt over what he did, but his wife told him to suck it up because he isn't a man if he doesn't. This introduced another smaller theme about the struggle for what masculinity is between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. How does Lady Macbeth's attitude challenge Macbeth's masculinity?
But anyway, the guilt eats away at both of them, driving Lady Macbeth insane so that she ends up killing herself. She basically confesses to a doctor and servant while she is sleepwalking because, well, I guess she needed to talk about it.
Would have been easier to just hire a shrink.
Macbeth's guilt makes him paranoid, which makes him even more obsessed with his fate, which causes him to go on a killing spree, which creates even more guilt, which in turn drives him crazy. While Lady Macbeth kills herself to end the guilt she feels, Macbeth's guilt and lack of sanity increases his desire to remain king, but totally removes his will to live, because that makes sense.
So was Macbeth a victim of fate or his own undoing?
So there are several questions left unanswered by the play that are directly tied to the themes. First would be guilt. Why does Lady Macbeth's guilt drive her to kill herself? Could it be because she tries so hard to suppress it? And why does Macbeth's guilt drive him to kill other people?
Next we have fate. Why at first does Macbeth accept that Banquo's sons will become kings, then decide he has to stop them? And how does Macbeth's view on fate change throughout the play? Does Lady Macbeth influence that change?
And then paranoia. How are Macbeth's guilt and his paranoia connected?
How does Macbeth's paranoia lead him to kill Banquo and want to kill Macduff? The play doesn't really answer most of these questions, but it's some food for thought.
There you have it. This was our crash course. See you next time.